A century and a half ago, our nation was born. Here was adopted the Declaration of Independence, which proclaimed our freedom.
All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Near here was adopted the Constitution of the United States, which guarantees our freedom, which determines that neither king nor dictator, but only we the people shall rule.
Dr. Franklin, you've just come from the Constitutional Convention. What have we got? A republic or a monarchy?
A republic, if you can keep it so.
Okay, that was not worth it. I noticed 5 people came in the room and then 2 left. Bad idea. Okay, chalk that up to learning. Liz, thank you for joining me here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Mike.
Yes, and welcome to those of you that stayed through that dumb clip. I thought that was funny. I was watching people are leaving. Should I stop it? No. Anyway, Liz, thanks for being here. Like I said, you are from the Ben Franklin's World podcast, and we know each other through the podcast world. And though it was nice to be able to talk to you in person, sort of, not in person, but as best as we can do during these COVID times.
Yeah, definitely excited about that. We've been corresponding for a while, so it's kind of nice to meet sort of face to face.
Yeah. Which will make it easier when we do actually see each other in person sometime. Are you going to any of these conferences coming up? I see them kind of. Are you speaking at any of them?
I'm actually speaking at Intelligent Speech, which is kind of more for educational podcasting. So tickets just went on sale for that. It's on April 24th. That will be virtual. And they get a pretty good international audience for it as well.
And what is it called again?
It's called Intelligent Speech.
Nice.
So Roy Field Brown, I forgot the name of his podcast. He has another history podcast, but he's one of the organizers of it.
Yeah, there must be like a ton of history podcasts now, huh?
There's definitely more now than when I started.
Yeah.
I started in 2014 and there was a handful and there wasn't even anyone really doing early American history. So I started one and now it's like, don't start a podcast about early American history. That niche is too broad. But it's perspective, right?
Yeah, totally. How funny. And so you've been doing your podcast for a while now and it is your main job, right?
Yeah, it started out as a hobby and then became my job.
It's interesting. So interesting how people fall into podcasting that actually become as their. I remember that was kind of the pitch years ago of like, quit your day job, do your podcast. And I always thought, that's kind of nuts for people because back then it was like nobody could really do that. I had a podcast that worked for me because I used it for sales for my business. And it was fantastic. Like I've told that story a million times, but it was like if I wanted to work with Liz Covart, I would have I would get you on my podcast. I didn't care if anybody listened to it. And back then, nobody really was listening to any podcast, especially that one. So
there was that time, right, when you had to explain to potential guests what a podcast was.
Exactly. Yeah, and so funny. And you would say, I would say, it's an internet radio show, is what I said every time. Yeah. And then explain how it works and stuff. So I appreciate you coming and speaking. Do you want to talk? So in your talk, do you talk about how you do the Ben Franklin's World? I kind of wanted to talk about it. We can talk about that afterwards. I'm sure people will have questions.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to talk about whatever. I love podcasting, and I can talk about it all day, like it's my job. But I did bring a little presentation. About the history of radio and what we can learn learn from it, because it turns out that podcasting and radio, they have many shared connections.
Yeah. So why don't we jump into your presentation, and then afterwards, I know that people will ask questions and I have questions for you. And then why don't we do that? Does That sound good? Or
sounds great.
And then if you have questions in the audience, please just shoot them up, and then I can throw them up on the screen if you want, Liz, and or not. I can ignore them until the end.
No, you can throw them up. I'll keep this really informal. So if you do have questions, please feel free to ask. I want to get through this actually kind of quickly so we can talk.
Okay, great. All right, so let's get your thing up on the screen here, and then I will go away for a little bit, but I'll be here, Liz. Don't worry. All right. So and then I'll go away. Go ahead and get started.
All right. So I'm a historian by training. I have a PhD in history, which I got at University of California, Davis, so not too far from some of you. I spent 3 years living in Davis. I'm now in Boston, and I work for an organization called the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture, which is an independent research organization at William & Mary. So William & Mary's my employer. And as a historian, I specialized in the American Revolution, but I got into podcasting about early American history. And as a historian, I'm naturally thinking, okay, we have all these podcasters telling us that, they've invented something new, like crowdfunding and different business models for their podcasts. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure that we've been here before. So I started digging into the history of radio, which is very modern history for me because it's late 19th, early 20th century history. And I found that, there are a lot of shared roots between podcasting and radio. And ultimately in this talk, I'll talk a little bit more about educational podcasting, because regardless of what kind of podcast you have, most of us are trying to educate people about something, whether it's our businesses or history, is in the case of me here. So the history of radio, I'm just going to skip that slide. Like I said, I just want to kind of go through quickly. Really starts in 1899 with Guillermo Marconi. He was Italian, but he's also half English because of his parentage. He invents this wireless telegraphy device. So if you think about how people could communicate by the end of the 19th century, the end of the 1800s, there's the telegraph. Makes a huge difference, especially around the time of the Civil War. In fact, the state of Nevada actually telegraphed their constitution to Washington. So the dots and dashes going through from coast to coast, that's all great, but it's very expensive because you need a wired network to do. So what was great about Marconi's device is he's figured out a way to send these dots and dashes of Morse code through the ether. That's what they called it, through the air, to different places. And it got really serious in 1901 when Marconi and his team increased their ability to send messages long distance. So in 1901, they send the first letter S, the first dots and dashes for S, some 2,000 miles between Canada to England. So that's your first transatlantic communication, wireless communication right there. So this news is very exciting to this newspaperman in New York City. His name was James Gordon Bennett, and he thinks that wireless telegraphy is going to be the next great business invention. And part of that is because newspapers like Herald are spending 10 cents per word to transmit information between New York and London over the telegraph wires. And business people were typically spending 25 cents per word, which is a bit more because they weren't doing it as frequently. And to put that into perspective, that's like $7.62 per word a day now, that 25 cents. So trying to communicate across the ocean and across the country was still a very expensive endeavor. So one of the ideas with Marconi's device is maybe this would just become a bit cheaper. Now, the thing with Marconi is his idea of what the wireless telegraph could be was very limited. He's not imagining, the radio where you turn it on and you hear music and all sorts of entertainment. He really sees it as an invention that is going to be primarily used for point-to-point communication between businesses and to get, the news across the ocean and the country when they need it. So when we talk about radio, we also have to talk about the technology. I mean, this is like us talking about mics and what kind of audio interfaces we use, right? Well, because Marconi was so limited in what he thought that the radio could do, this leaves space for other innovators to come in. So Reginald Fessenden and Lee DeForest come in. They make Fessden makes the alternate transmitter, which makes it possible to send voice and music transmission across the airwaves. And DeForest invents Audion tube, which makes it possible to receive the voices and music and whatever it is you're sending across the airwaves. So this is a great invention, and it leads to a radio boom. So there are actually several radio booms, but the first one is between 1906 and 1910. And the reason there was this radio boom is that now all of a sudden there's this technology where you can send messages back and forth. And we're not talking about verbal messages at this point. We're talking still about sending telegraph-like messages, except there's no wires involved. So anybody who can build one of these radios, which becomes significantly cheaper once you get something like the carbonundrum crystal, because lots of radios at this point are do-it-yourself kits. Once you do that, then you can be on the airways sending your own dots and dashes in your messages across. And this becomes a problem because people start crowding the airwaves. So you start to see, especially around after 1912, some heavy regulations come down. And the reason for that is because of the Titanic. So if you think about what the world is like, the Titanic is like, we know, right? The largest ship. It's supposed to be the most grand ship. It's supposed to have all the technological and latest features. And it did. One of the technological features that this ship had was a telegraphy device, a wireless telegraphy device. But there were really no laws anywhere that required all ships to carry this device. So what happens on the night of April 13, 1912, we know that the Titanic hits an iceberg, and they start sending out dots and dashes in this new code, SOS. And the problem is there's so many people that start to clog the airwaves, and messages about what happened to the Titanic start getting garbled. Plus, there's plenty of ships that actually passed, within a couple miles of Titanic that could have reached them sooner than the ship that comes to rescue the passengers who make it out before the ship sinks. But they didn't have the wireless telegraphy devices. So this comes to be seen as a real safety problem. So they start to regulate radio. So basically you'd have to learn Morse code. You'd have to be licensed to run a radio. You'd have to, if you're an amateur radio operator, you had to stay off the major airwaves. Certain airwaves would be designated for the military. And now all ships are going to have to carry this device. So that's when we start to see a lot of the first regulations come in on radio. So the other interesting thing about radio is, as I said, when it's initially conceived, people are thinking of it as a business tool, a business to business, B2B marketing tool in some ways. And what changes that is this guy, Frank Conrad. So Frank Conrad had worked for Westinghouse in Pittsburgh. And in 1916, he was a tinkerer and an engineer. He takes out a license called KDKA 360, which is still a prominent radio station in Pittsburgh. He takes this out, and that is the station that he operates out of his barn. And as he's experimenting in 1920, in May of 1920, he hooks up his phonograph, and then he takes his, microphone there and holds it by the phonograph, and there goes out the first music over the airwaves. And Westinghouse loves this because if you think about it, they make radios. And if you think about who's buying them at this point, it's only other businesses, really. But if you had this device that could receive messages that you broadcast, you could generate income. You can generate a whole new business model. So they actually move Frank Conrad's station to the Westinghouse building, and they started, what's considered one of the first professional radio stations. So you'd have music and entertainment, and you'd have, sports. Sports are really popular. And, this becomes a business. But the question of this, when it becomes a business, is who's going to pay for the radio? So there's many debates on this. Who's going to pay for broadcasting? Are you going to rely on Westinghouse and other radio manufacturers? They think it's great for generating business, but they don't really want to be in the business of running radio stations full time. Station owners, could they pay for it? Because Westinghouse and AT&T and General Electric and RCA are seeing great responses to people buying radios, businesses want to get in on it. So you start to see radio stations pop up in like big department stores or feed stores out in the Midwest and West, or newspapers might start a radio station. So lots of people were starting radio stations. But, you have to pay the DJs and you have to pay the talent, the live talent that comes into your studio to get the music out. You'd have to pay, I don't know if there's music licensing, but, that's something they may have had to consider. So it's expensive. Or should listeners maybe pay for the radio? So there's all these questions of who's going to pay for it. In the meantime, there's questions of advertisers and taxpayers. First off, nobody really wanted advertisers on the radio, but as the networks like NBC, ABC, CBS start to appear, you start to see advertisers, because it turns out some things don't change. Content is free to consume, but it is not free to produce. So in order to get the type of content, the high quality content that people wanted, they needed these big networks to produce those shows. So you would need to have advertisers. So I see someone in the chat has said that music licensing came in later. Awesome. I didn't really remember that fact, so I appreciate you reminding us of that. And taxpayers. There's a question about taxpayers. Could they pay for the radio? This is what happens in Canada and in Great Britain. The BBC, the CBC, they're taxpayer supported, and for a while they're taxpayer completely funded. And so people start in the United States to think about, well, would the USDA be a department where you could actually get people, taxpayers, to pay for radio? And the reason for this is one of the big programs, of course, especially in an agrarian economy in many places, is that the USDA is constantly giving out weather information and market information. Is now a good time to harvest your crops and bring them to market? Follow USDA, basically radio, to find out. And it was because of this mission to try to help people that lots of universities get involved with radio. So during the 1920s, you start to see a lot of radio colleges and universities launch radio stations. By January of 1923, there are 72 universities, colleges, and schools with licensed radios. And they're doing this for a couple reasons. One is educational. It becomes a marketing tool to get students to your university when you have a radio, because you would have, you have people wanting to know about this technology, engineering students wanting to tinker with things. So if you had a radio station on campus, that's a big draw. The other reason is, similar to the USDA, you'd have these land grant schools, Penn State, Michigan State, Wisconsin. I don't know if the University of California is a land grant institution or not, but a lot of state universities are. And the reason that state universities were formed, in part, was to help improve things for the communities around them. So that's why so many of them are like a UC Davis, which is an agricultural-based school, to help with this mission of bettering the community. So one of the innovators in radio was actually this guy, Professor Earl M. Terry, and he's out of the University of Wisconsin, Madison. That's a picture of that guy there. And so in 1917, Terry just began sending out daily weather reports by Morse code. And he had several hundred listeners from the farm communities around Madison do it. And by 1919, he developed his own vacuum tubes that he needed to send voice out. So by the end of 1920, you actually have voice broadcasts coming from 9XM, which is later WHA radio, from the University of Wisconsin, and people out in Texas could hear this radio station when the clouds and stuff were right. Another educational opportunity that you'd have for colleges and such when they came out is that there was this idea, kind of like we have now, podcast. You can bring education to people and you can uplift them by giving them knowledge that they can use, and help improve society by providing more knowledge. And so teachers who teach at universities, they're often very excited about sharing the knowledge and the research they're doing with everyone. So a lot of these early professors get very excited about the idea that they could use radio to bring education to the masses, to bring their research to the masses. So a few years ago, you may remember the term MOOC, which stands for Massive Open Online Course. We don't really use that term anymore, but I mean, they still have MOOCs. Well, the first MOOC wasn't invented in the early 2000s. It was actually invented in 1921 when the University of Nebraska-Lincoln started with a radio MOOC. Basically, they broadcast a course at a set hour each day or each week, and anybody could learn from the course. And if you were willing to pay $12.50, which today would be approximately $183, you'd receive a textbook and a graded examination. And if you passed the course, you'd get 2 college credits that were transferable that you could use if you enrolled in a degree program. So people got very excited about educational radio, but it starts to kind of fall by the wayside, because if you think about how radio is broadcast, you have the airwaves. And oftentimes it's just locally that you can hear the airwaves. And, depending on whether you're on the AM frequency or the FM frequency, things like weather can impact your ability to hear what's being broadcast on those airwaves. Plus, you have the fact that the government is regulating what dials and stuff, what bandwidths you can use and broadcast under. And universities are really at the low end of the frequency. And oftentimes they had to share their frequency with other radio stations. So this becomes a big problem, is that universities couldn't reliably get their information out to the wider populace with even in their state that they were hoping to do. Because the question, of course, was, well, how are you going to make educational radio pay? There's always just been this idea that knowledge should be free and freely accessible to everyone, but we don't often consider that knowledge takes a lot of time to produce. And we all know as podcasters, right, that content, developing materials that can convey that knowledge out into the world is time consuming and can be expensive. Radio does become more popular as the 1920s go on. You start to see the National Broadcasting Company come out, this Columbia Broadcasting Company come out, and these big networks come out because people are demanding nation-to-nation service. It's not enough to know what's happening in Nebraska, right? People in Nebraska want to know what's happening in California and what's happening in Washington, D.C., New York, and Boston. They want to know what their countrymen are doing up in Detroit. So what people were asking for was basically a nationwide broadcasting service where they could hear similar programs to everyone around the country, and they could create some kind of common ground and stay well informed. But the only way to do this at the time, even though you have wireless telegraphy, is you need wires to send this kind of programming from one end of the country to the next end of the country reliably. And there was only one place that had the wires that went coast to coast, and that was AT&T. And AT&T was all happy to share their wires coast to coast, but they charged a heavy rental fee. And so these big networks formed in part because they were trying to basically put together a really nice schedule of content that would give people the national content that they were looking for, the dance shows, the talk shows, the sports, things that people were interested in, and that they'd be able to get advertisers for, because creating this radio content was very expensive. And I'm just looking here because I thought I had a figure for what it cost. Yeah. So in 1933, the cost of sponsoring a radio show might be $2,500 a week. And for us, that means about $47,300 today. So producing high quality radio became very expensive. So in terms of educational radio, it just kind of continues to have this problem, like who's going to pay for it? The big networks really weren't all that interested in it. They needed a government mandate before they started really producing educational program. And often when they'd have that program, they'd rent it or buy the licensing from the BBC and rebroadcast BBC shows. Or they would have things like the NBC Music Appreciation Hour that they'd have, but they'd run that, during primetime times, like at 11 a.m. on a Friday. So educational radio faced a ton of barriers when it came out. And people decided they were going to leave it to wealthy foundations to try and support that kind of programming. So we still have this model today, for, educational productions, whether it be a podcast, a radio show, documentary, where if you seriously want to do it, you need to have serious dollars and, these big organizations are the ones that you're going to go to. Mellon is another one now that people go to. So it became kind of like this funding mechanism for radio. And a lot of people have seen it as being inadequate. So in terms of where this leaves us, between podcast and radios, there are a lot of similarities. Crowdfunding developed with the early days of radios. Podcasters didn't invent that. Having live shows, we'd like to talk about live podcasts. Again, in the 1930s, you'd have things like there was a barn dance program out of Chicago, and those radio personalities and the musicians and the dancers used to travel around the country to try and raise money for their show. We think of stats and our obsession with knowing who's listening developed with us. And while we do have fancier metrics, these radio stations were actually importing people from like Austria who had really great statistical minds to develop this whole way of measuring leadership. So they used to have, Alka-Seltzer would say, if you would like this free product, we'd like to know more about you. So send us this postcard in, and then we'll send you like the free glass or whatever that they were offering at the time. So there's a lot of shared connections between the two media. And I really do think, and I guess this is because I'm a historian, but I really do think that it's important to kind of know what came before us so we can truly innovate in the future. So questions about how do we fund educational programs like Ben Franklin's World that offer high quality podcasts that make, the latest historical scholarship available to people in a way that can be understood. How are we going to fund that? I did get a job out of it, but we're not making money. So kind of looking at the history of radio can show us where we've been, what worked a little bit, what didn't work a little bit, and what about these old funding models we can both apply today and maybe just kind of ignore and move on from, so we can innovate. So I'm just going to kind of leave it at there because I know you probably have other questions. If you are interested more in the history of radio and more about the early American history, if you text history to 33444, I have a bibliography or, works cited, but it lists a bunch of books and articles that you can read about the history of radio if it's something that you would like to research further.
That's super cool. What a great ending slide.
Yeah.
Yeah. So pretty fascinating. I wondered right away, when you put together your podcasts, how does the content, how do you pick an episode for Ben Franklin's World? How does the content go?
It's not as easy as it used to be. It used to be, I want to meet this person, I'm interested in their work. And even in the beginning, it was like, they're on social media. Like they must know how a podcast works. So in some ways, that tried to happen. That's the way content was selected. I've named the program Ben Franklin's World because Ben Franklin was into everything. And most people know when you look at him, even if they don't know exactly who it is, they know approximately when he lived. And while the show covers early American history from 1450 to 1820, the bulk of what we do is during that long 18th century, which goes from about halfway through the 17th century into the early part of the 19th century. And that's the bulk of what the program covers. And we do a lot of revolutionary stuff on there. But now we think of things like, I didn't have listeners when we started. Now we have lots of listeners. So I think about their different requests for us. I'm doing some narrative work now. So like, for example, we're doing an episode that'll be narrative about the early American history of inoculation and vaccination, centering on smallpox, because that's, where the vaccination for smallpox developed in 1796. So we're working on that for April. We try to balance guests and viewpoints. We try to have diverse array of guests, both in topics and ethnicity and jobs. Not every historian works in a university. They work in museums. So this week's episode, we have a historian who's affiliated with a university in Dakar, Senegal. He's a head researcher and helped found the Whitney Plantation Museum down in Louisiana. And he's an expert on slavery. So we try to look for different ways to show not just the history, but also the work that historians do and the value of that.
And you say we. What is the we? Because I was going to ask that too. It was interesting to me. I've listened to your podcast, obviously, and I wondered about these people. Who are all these? Who are the we? Who's we?
Yeah, so the neat thing about my story is I started my podcast as a hobby. I finished graduate school deciding I did not want to be a professor and that I liked a lot of the public history work I've done. So I worked at the National Park Service, I'd volunteered at different museums and archives. So I liked the public outreach aspect. So what I thought I would do is like I would research and write a lot of books as an independent scholar, and I would podcast on the side because I needed an outlet where I could talk with history about, with people who were interested in it. And, I launched a show in October 2014 after 18 months of researching podcasts. I don't recommend that for people, but that's what I did. And then I launched a show, and within 3 months, I went to having a stable audience of about 25 to 30,000 downloads on a catalog that wasn't that big. So we continued to grow. And I started to have business side of history problems. Like this was a hobby. And all of a sudden, like I had 1 or 2 sponsors that didn't come through, but they'd inquired, right? And you're like, but, I knew enough that it's like, well, no matter how I do this is kind of like an endorsement. Like, even if I tell everybody it's an ad till I'm blue in the face, right? Like some listeners will hear it as an endorsement. So how do I negotiate that? I also went from begging people to be on the podcast, convincing them that this will be a lot of fun, to having colleagues ask me, to be on the show. And it was like, I didn't know how to say no, and as a junior colleague at that point, it was like, are they going to be mad at me the next time I see them at a conference? Like this is stuff going through my head. So I reached out to the Omohundro Institute, in 2015. I asked the director, I knew her from other conferences, if I could take her to lunch so I could pick her brain about my business side of history problems. And she ended up helping me, and we partnered in 2016, where once a month I would do an episode specifically for the Omohundro Institute. It was called the Doing History series. And by the end of 2016, it had worked out so great. They were actually, I think, a little afraid I was going to say no. I'm not going to do a second season, even though I was kind of gung-ho to do it. But the work and the financial realities of podcasting set in, and they said, would you take a job if we offered you a job and created you a job? And I was like, you mean like a job to podcast? And they were like, sure. So I do a lot of work for them now, but my primary responsibility is to produce this podcast. So when I say we, I mean the folks at the Omohundro Institute. I have a team that does different things on the podcast, some research for episodes and pre-prep, coordinating guests. I don't have to do that anymore. They help me when we do narrative episodes. It's always good to have somebody kind of go over your scripts and see that. So when I say we, I'm talking about Karen Wolf, the director of the OI, Martha Howard, who's director of communications, Joseph Edelman, who helps us out. He's actually a professor at Framingham State University, Holly White, who's my assistant producer, and myself. And sometimes we even have a grad assistant who helps us out with social media. So
Nice.
I think one of the big things I've learned in podcasting is like one of the ways that we can fund educational podcasting and radio and that sort of thing is making strategic partnerships. And so for me, joining the OI was a strategic partnership that we continue to work with, work with. So it's still my podcast, and we work on it together.
Nice. So there's some other questions in here now. So this is, what's the biggest change and issue from the start of your podcast to your most recent ones? What did you need to overcome? I bet there's a lot there.
Yeah, I'm having actually, it's a hard question to answer in the sense, like, I don't have like one big change. I would say that if you've listened from like the very beginning to now, you will notice a lot of change and a lot of growth as podcasting. So
sound
has greatly improved. I have always worked with a professional audio engineer. I work with Daryl Darnell at Pro Podcast Solutions now, but I have the training. Like that's how Mike and I know each other, is I like a big detailed podcast engineering class. I've gotten way more involved in the editing. And in fact, I still do the nitty gritty editing. But I have Daryl go through it, a couple more times. just to hear it. And he ends up mastering the episode for me and putting it in.
That's great.
So one of the things that you hear is like every episode I'm trying to get better, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And no episode is perfect, but I'm still trying to get there. And occasionally we experiment with new things. So this goes in with the next question, can we describe narrative episodes and how they differ? So Ben Franklin's World, what you'll mostly hear on it are interviews, mostly me interviewing one other scholar about a book or a historic site or a digital project or documentary edition, something history related. It's just me and them having a conversation. In the narratives, if you look at, in particular, episode 290 and 291, which we did at the end of the year, we did a 2-episode series called The World of the Wampanoag. And last year, 1620, was the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the Mayflower. So we wanted to look at the world that the Pilgrims landed in, which wasn't a European world, but very much a Native American world, and specifically Wampanoag. And so we interviewed, we did all this research that we needed to do. We learned about the Mayflower. We learned about the Native Americans who lived in the area. We read lots of books and articles about that. Then we contacted people who worked at Plymouth Plantation, who were representatives of Narragansett and Wampanoag tribal nations. We talked to other historians, and basically, I conducted individual interviews with them, but then I sliced up the interviews to tell the story I needed to tell. What was all the information that they did. So if you do it, it's like hearing a story. So it's kind of like hearing, if you want to go there, Serial, where they're trying to tell a story and they bring the audio in, or, leave it out, or, 99% Invisible, any of that kind of NPR style of a podcast, This American Life, those are narrative episodes. And we've started to do those as a way to investigate more deeply specific areas of history, like the world of the Wampanoag, or like the history of vaccination and inoculation, which is what we're working on now.
Very cool. All right. And then Lewis says, speaking of saying no, if someone contacts you don't think it's right fit for the podcast, how do you say no? Do you get back to them anyway?
I do. I respond to everyone. I'm always a little behind on my email, but I respond to everyone because I try to make it a thoughtful response. In terms of saying no, here's the thing. It's not about the person not being a right fit for your podcast. It's about the information not being a right fit. So we get pitched a lot by different book publishers and authors about books in particular, or historic sites that are really interesting, but they tend to maybe be a bit too very local for a podcast that purports to tell, Native American, American history in a wide swath. So in that case, I thank them for contacting me and thinking about the show. And then I said, right now, it depends, whether I want to put them off or be more solid, but, I'll say, this work.
They're probably listening right now too, so be careful.
That's fine. This work is not a good fit for the show. Here are some other podcasts or some other blogs where you might promote it. This will get you a thank you for your no, because you're being helpful in telling them no. And then you just sign off. So it's never about the person. Don't make it personal. Just make it being about the content not being a right fit. And then I haven't had nobody's been mad about it. And like I said, if you include a couple helpful links of where they might also promote their work, you tend to get thank you for their.
That's great advice. Great advice. George asks, how's Liz set up? Finding sponsorship. Part of the Institute provides a 501c3 to secure foundation and donation dollars.
Yeah. So the setup is, I do work for the Omohundro Institute, which, as I said, is an independent research organization about early American history and culture. They are part of William & Mary, but they are also an independent research institution. So they are set up with a 501c3, or 501c3, C3, however it is. But that's what I mean, a nonprofit organization. So It can take donations. So they have some funding for digital history work, which is how they fund the show, but it doesn't pay for that. In fact, I'm probably a large suck on their annual budget between my salary and the part-time salaries of everybody else who works on the show. Plus, I have vendors, right? I got to pay Daryl at Pro Podcast Solutions, which I'm always happy to do. for his work. I got to pay Libsyn. I got to pay, Squadcast. So they take care of those costs. We work with a media agent. We're working with Chant FM now to try and find sponsors for the show. I'm sorry, I'm reading questions and answering, and I shouldn't be doing that.
It is hard to do.
Yeah, sorry, it gets distracting. But anyway, they take donations, but we also are working with Chant FM to secure outside sponsors. It's pretty hard for our podcast because we're top 3%, which means we're pretty big and expensive if somebody wants a quick ad buy, but not big enough to get ZipRecruiter and those kinds of sponsors on a bigger show. And I also have an even gender balance, which I've been told is horrible for trying to find podcast sponsors, because, there are a lot of products that skew male or female, and they don't want to advertise on my show completely. So no Harry's razors for me. We also have started crowdfunding. So I use Supporting Cast. So I'm offering a subscription. The thing with Patreon, and I like the Patreon model, but I don't have time to be offering people extras. We're on the highly produced side. We're spending at least an hour per minute you hear of labor on the podcast between pre-production till it hits the feed. So that's an incredible amount of labor. If we're doing those narrative storytelling episodes, that's almost double. It's almost like 2 hours of labor for every minute you hear. So I ask listeners to support us. It's $6.99 a month or $60 per year, and they get ad-free episodes. So I just have Daryl take the mid-roll out, and they get a monthly bonus episode, which is listeners ask a lot of questions, and sometimes they really don't fit the conversation that we're having. And so I ask the scholar to stay online and answer those questions. And sometimes it's just like bonus takes and stuff. So I offer one of those once a month for that. We are also seeking out grant institutions. So the World of the Wampanoag series that I mentioned, episodes 290 and 291, that was done in partnership with Mass Humanities. So Mass Humanities is the NEH granting arm for the state of Massachusetts. They approached me about doing something for the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower. We talked about doing something very Native American focused and centered. And so we were able to work it out where they paid for the custom scoring. We have a lot of Native American music in that was organized by the composer we hired, Joel Roston. He wrote some original music for that and then figured out exactly where the music needs to go, which is not a skill I have. So we were able to do that because of that funding. And we're still, we're talking to a potential corporate sponsor. We are still working out the funding models, but that's how it works. But I guess you could say I cashed in that I get paid salary, whether the podcast makes money or not.
Right.
So from that end, I hit the podcast lottery, but I am still very dedicated. I don't want this to be a drain on the OI. It does a lot of work. I'd like it to be able to do more work. So we are still trying to find a way to make it financially sustainable.
Very cool. All right. Well, there's a ton of questions in here. Or do you want to pick one? You can see them too.
Yeah.
I mean, it's all pretty fascinating, and those were kind of my questions I had written down, kind of about funding models and other things too. Have you seen that Glow FM thing with the referral stuff? Have you seen that at all?
I looked at Glow initially before we did Supporting Cast, and at that time I think it was Kimberlite.
Yeah, but they just rolled it out. I think who was talking about it last time. Anyway, it might be something interesting.
Yeah,
you're getting your audience to refer, and you're giving them little gifty things or whatever. I think it might have been Sean Howard talking about that from Fable and Folly.
Yeah, we're definitely using Supporting Cast, which is the white label software from Slate. So it's the same software that they use for Slate Plus. And it was just a figure of I had to roll it out and that stuff was ready. But it does a pretty great job. It offers gift subscriptions. I could now make custom push notifications to people who join, like voice notifications to people who join. I haven't because again, I'm busy making content.
Yeah.
So it's just a lot to balance. And Royfield asked about the speaking. Yes, speaking is part of my job at the Institute. If I receive an honorarium, anytime I talk about the podcast, that is a revenue stream. So, it's not like a huge revenue stream, but, whether it's $50 or $1,000, I kick that back to the Institute to help pay for the podcast because they're usually paying for my time to help prepare that sort of speaking engagement. intelligent speech. I'll be doing that on the weekend, preparing that. But I am looking forward to that. So if you get a chance to come to the conference.
Very cool. So, and then let's see, Jen says, what about nonprofits like the Thomas Jefferson Foundation? Inventor Angle, do nonprofits advertise on podcasts?
They haven't really advertised on podcasts. We've approached that. The advertisement they get is when they usually give us some sort of grant or funding. And then we mentioned at the start and the end of the show, we always say Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute. Actually, I always say that. That's my line. Mm-hmm. And when we get additional support, it'll say and support. And this episode was made possible with support from such and such foundation. So they don't advertise in it. We've also looked at book publishers, but academic presses, which are, most of the books that we talk about, they don't have the marketing budget, to buy a sponsorship. Now, Cornell University Press tried it out on me, early on. So there was some buy-in there. The other complicating factor is the Omohundro Institute has a publishing partner with the University of North Carolina Press. So just from a tactical standpoint, there hasn't been a lot of pressure to try and advertise like we would take like Yale University Press's sales ad, just because of the awkward nature of that. But yes, we have looked at partnerships like that.
It is interesting. I know we talked about Matt Bogosian's podcast that you were on, What's America's Purpose, and he's been having a kind of an issue trying to find funding for his too. But it's an interesting world. I mean, how to find. There are a lot of avenues, but it's just like finding the right one.
It's also difficult. Like one thing that, one of the positives that working with the Omohundro Institute is like, I can look for grant funding. Like the NEH and a lot of these institutions will only grant money to an institution like the OI or a university, mm-hmm. or, a historic site that's, in the right way, unless you're an institution that can accept grant money as an individual, that kind of funding you're kind of locked out of.
Right. Okay. What's this one here? Do you stick to structure rigidly during your show, or does each episode alter the format?
Each episode is custom, but the majority of the interview episodes really do follow the same structured format. And there's a couple of reasons of this. One is listeners like you to shake it up, but they don't want you to shake it up too much. They like to know exactly, how long it's going to take to listen to your podcast. Because if they're a regular listener, they've slotted you into their life. So I actually get complaints if, on the occasion where we have like a 90-minute episode, they think that that's, too long. They slotted me in for 45 to 60 minutes. So we do that. We have been offering the narrative style. Listeners do like that. For our 300th episode, which is coming up in April, we're doing a different format where and this is kind of new news because we haven't really talked about this publicly, but we're asking, April 13th is when the episode drops, which is also my birthday, and I'll be 40 this year. So we've asked 40 different historians to answer the same question. What is it about vast early American history? What it is about the history of vast early America that they wish more people understood? And we're going to create an episode out of all those, 60-second, 45 to 60-second clips. So we do play with format a little bit, but we try to keep the format of the show pretty regular. So people listen comfortable. And the advantage of having a structure also helps you with your workflow and editing. Like when you consistently stay with the same format, exactly about how much time everything will take you. Of course, editing, some episodes are faster than others.
And the audience appreciates that because it's like, that's why all these sitcoms and TV shows are all the same, format.
We're conditioned to like format. So I would say, mix it up. We mix it up every once in a while, but it's like, we're talking about like 4 to 6 times a year that we do that.
All right. And then let's see. Jen says, can you share examples of which companies do not fit with your podcast values and ethics? It's kind of a hard one to answer.
Yeah, it's hard one to answer because I haven't really come up, and I wouldn't want to naysay any companies. That seems to be a policy, but I will say in a more positive way, I'm always looking for advertisers that provide real value to my audience. So, something like meal prep is something we can all do. Eating is a very human nature. So, we've done meal prep kits on the podcast. I use SaneBox. We had SaneBox on the podcast. So I do try to look for products and services I use because most people do want a personal endorsement. And I'm very careful about that.
Yeah.
So I only endorse things that I actually use and really like. And otherwise, the ad reads people get from me are very positive, and I've tied them into history. There's always a little historical component, but it's not the I love this and I used this last night kind of ad for me. And that's just ethical way that I think of things, and want to be. If I don't use it and I don't like it, then you're probably not a good fit for the show.
Since a lot of the people in this group are kind of podcast nerdos, what is your equipment like, Jane? There, what is it from the microphone down to the software? What are you using?
So I use an Electro Voice RE320, which I really liked. I use I have a vintage Electro Voice RE20 that I really like, but the 320 just works better in the studio that I moved into a year ago, and all the fancy looking like wood behind me is actually sound foam. So I do have a studio. So if you can see the Fenway Park scoreboard, I'm a huge Red Sox fan. That is also sound foam, and then I have some stuff over here. So that helps, of course, with the audio quality. I use the Heil PL2T boom arm. It's very quiet. It keeps the wires tucked away, which I really like. I have a 43-inch LG monitor, which really helps with the editing because then I don't have to go back and forth as often as I would on a smaller monitor. And I also don't have the breaks between two monitors. I've been using a Mix Pre 6 for my audio interface for the last 6 or 7 months now. I love it. It was expensive, but I feel it's totally worth it. Like the preamps on it for my mic are great, and I have incredible control over my game, which is important because I was telling Mike before, like right in front of my desk I have these sound dampening curtains because we live in a very nice building, but it's also near a highway. So we can get some traffic and truck noise, although right now is rush hour in Boston, so that's why it's pretty quiet. I use a MacBook Pro laptop to edit the show. That's my computer thing. Everything plugs into there. I use Squadcast for conducting interviews. I use Adobe Audition to edit. I use RX8 to help fix audio from Isotope. So pretty standard. And like I said, I do have Daryl Darnell who does this professionally, where engineering for me is still kind of a hobby. He goes through the show pretty well, and he's at Pro Podcast Solutions. And then
you're hosting with Libsyn.
And I host with Libsyn. I have apps through them. I have the big stats package with them. So Libsyn works out really nice for me.
Very cool.
And I have a WordPress website, if you want to get that technical.
Yeah. Oh, it's just people are interested always in what do people do. And then the other question too is like, one thing is like how are you connecting with your audience? Like is it email or what's the best way you find? Because I know several people that have had successful podcasts and now just started an email list. It's like, I think that's very important, but how are you connecting?
So I have an email list, which I started collecting from day one.
Right.
But I'm bad in that I don't advertise it too much, although I am now. Like in the show, I'm preparing episodes that have reminders that we have this email list, and it pretty much auto sends. I pretty much only email people like when I have something exciting to say, or around the holidays to say thank you for listening. I do a lot of interactions on social media. So there's a lot of people on Twitter, but most of our listener base is on Facebook, which is funny because I don't really like Facebook and I wouldn't be on it, but that's where my listeners are. So that's where I am. And so we have a listener community on Facebook that has spawned things like its own book club. Now there's a couple listeners, like we started a book club as a trial last year, found Holly, my assistant producer, and I couldn't continue, but some listeners have taken it over and started their own book club. So now they have a community. I do interact a lot via email. Like I said, I'm a little behind, but I really respond to the queries that people send. I feel like a reference historian and reference librarian a lot, because sometimes I don't know the answer and I have to send you somewhere else. But I always try to give a thoughtful response. And when we're traveling, when it's not a pandemic, because I do speak and go to a lot of conferences, should we be so lucky to go to podcast movement in August, right? I'll tell my
Yeah.
listeners, like, hey, I'm in Nashville. Let's get together for a meetup. And sometimes they're small. Sometimes it's just like 1 or 2 people. And other times there's like 25 people or more who show up. I mean, the Denver, Colorado one I had a couple years ago was huge.
That's fun.
And people would drive, and the West is so big. I live in New England, so my conception of geography is small. If it takes you over an hour, that's like an overnight trip. But people came in from like 3 and 4 hours.
That's fun.
To have a
so
meetup.
fun.
So
That's so fun. And I had years ago when I did the meetings podcast where I was standing in line somewhere talking to someone, and the person behind me, oh, are you Mike McCallan and it was just such a shocking thing. I was like, oh, someone listens. It scared me. I saw, whoa, there's a person, but it's an interesting, podcasting is so fun in that way, that there are people out there, especially when you're in your closet talking to yourself basically. And then all of a sudden you're somewhere and there's people that are listening. It's such a wonderful thing. And most of the people here who have podcasts know that,
And I do think it's important to connect with your listeners and try to be where they are and interact with them. Because if we think about it, right, I mean, history is all about people, but podcasting is all about people and the connections that you form. So I think those are important to nurture.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time. There's one last question in here. As a show that focuses on historical events, have you incorporated any music from the time in question, and are there licensing concerns?
So we have custom theme music. The first one was a Bach piece, which was, pretty inexpensive to produce because they found, the performance copyright free on YouTube. So the engineer who did that initially was able to produce that. About 2 years ago, we switched to different custom music, which is by Breakmaster Cylinder. I emailed them on a whim because I felt like every podcast had Breakmaster Cylinder music, but I didn't. And it turns out they were really fun to work with. Like I didn't actually expect to hire them, but it was just so fun. We did that. The music we have in our episodes really is limited to those like produced theme music segments that we have. I have a segment called The Time Warp, and Breakmaster Cylinder did that for us too. The music that you hear in the narrative episodes, and there's really only one case of this, the World of the Wampanoag series, when we can get additional funding, we do hire a composer, and he does a lot of historical research in it. And he will recreate a historical piece or use a historical piece for inspiration to create new music for us. And like I said, we use Joel Ralston, and he went through and picked out exactly where the music needed to go in our show. So I think music can add a lot, but it is expensive because of the licensing and especially with history, right? Like I feel like we're a serious podcast about history. We have fun and everything's accessible and whatnot. But like, if we're going to do music, like it should be the right music. So,
yeah. And also I wanted to ask you before we go, I played that silly clip that I found that I thought would be silly to play. Tell me what you thought about that clip.
That clip is dated. What people don't realize, my colleague, Zara Annis Hanslin, who's a professor at the University of Delaware, she wrote an article for Smithsonian about that Franklin line, about a republic if you can keep it. And it was to talk about the fact that women had lots of political ideas and that Franklin kind of gave her the brush off in reality. But I mean, for the time it's produced, it was black and white, right? It was probably produced in the 50s or early 60s. That's pretty par for the course. But I would also say that early American history is so much more than dead white dudes. It's really important for us to know how the institutions and ideas that have come to form the society and government we have today take shape. And you can only do that by looking at the vastness and the very diverse nature of early American history and seeing all the different peoples and events and concerns that played out, in the 17th and 18th and early 19th centuries.
Exactly. All right, Liz. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And I left your contact stuff up here the whole time we were chatting, so people can get a hold of Liz, and you can always get a hold of me. And thank you so much, Liz.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been fun.
Yeah, great. Okay, bye-bye, everybody.